rise today to speak on Bill S-211, an act respecting the national framework on sports betting advertising. Let me begin with a simple observation. Canadians are noticing a change. Hockey games, football games, family shows, even online videos are now full of sports betting ads. What used to show up once in a while is now constant. They're tired of seeing their favorite celebrities and athletes encouraging gambling at every commercial break. For many Canadians, especially young people, these athletes and celebrities are role models. When those same public figures are used to promote gambling, it carries a level of influence that goes beyond typical advertisement. In 2021, Parliament made the decision to legalize single-event sports betting. People were already doing it, often through unregulated sites. Bringing it into the legal system helped provinces regulate it. But since then, something else has happened. Sports betting has exploded. That's why S-211 is trying to deal with it. At its core, this is about trying to get a better handle on this fast-growing industry. Before we get into the contents of this bill, it's important to be clear about how things currently work. Provinces are mainly in charge of gaming. Some have stricter rules than others. They license companies, set rules, and in some cases, they even operate the platforms themselves. But advertising is different. Ads don't stop at provincial borders. You can watch the same advertisement if you're in Vancouver or Kitchener Centre. This is part of why the issue has become more noticeable. This also raises a basic question. Why is this one area of advertising so lightly regulated when so many others are tightly controlled? We already regulate gambling differently than any other product because it's not like other forms of advertising. This is something that can influence behavior in ways that require extra caution. A great example that comes to mind is the limits placed on alcohol and tobacco advertisements. We have limits on when ads can run, where they appear, and how they can be targeted. We need to protect our young people, and it would be reasonable to ask why a similar thing wouldn't apply here. Mr. Speaker, it's worth looking at the impact that this is having around us. In 2025, a study from the American Institute for Boys and Men found that in states with legalized sports betting, there was a clear sign of financial strain on families. Credit scores went down and more people fell into debt troubles, collections, and missed payments. Bankruptcy rose by as much as 25 to 30% a few years after online betting was introduced. It means that individuals struggling with addiction face constant triggers with very little protection. For someone working to regain control of gambling addiction, constant exposure to these betting ads isn't just background noise. It's a huge barrier on the path to recovery. It can be difficult to move forward when the same messaging appears during games, online and across multiple platforms. For those individuals, it's real. We need to recognize that constant exposure can make a difficult situation even harder. Even beyond the statistics, there's a real impact here that we can't afford to overlook. When gambling becomes more visible with constant exposure, it doesn't just affect the individual, but the entire household. Families feel the strain when money that should be going towards mortgage or rent, groceries or savings is instead lost through gambling. It's also important to recognize that not all families feel this equally. For those already dealing with rising cost of living or financial pressure, even small losses can have a much greater impact. In an economy where Canadians are already stretched thin, this is not a minor concern. We also see the emotional toll this can take. It creates stress in relationships, arguments at home, and in some cases, it can cause a breakdown of trust within families. What may start as a casual betting can turn into a pattern that becomes difficult to control. Unfortunately, that pressure is felt most by spouses, children, and parents. This is why exposure matters. When gambling is constantly promoted while the family is sitting down for Saturday night hockey, it normalizes behavior and can carry big risks for households. It makes it much harder for those trying to step back from gambling to actually avoid it. For many fans, it's also changing the experience of the game itself. What used to be about the sports is increasingly tied to odds, bets, and promotions. We also know that protecting young people is a major concern here. A number of weeks ago, Dr. Sean Kelly shared that in his practice, he's meeting children as young as 14 who are already struggling with gambling behaviors. He also shared that even at home, his own son is starting to ask questions like the difference between over-under and plus-minus while watching hockey highlights. It's no wonder why 21% of our sports broadcasting time is often made up of gambling advertisements. This issue is already part of our everyday conversation. When something moves from being niche to being a part of daily life so quickly, it's reasonable for us to take notice and analyze if the rules have kept pace. At the same time, there's a broader question about responsibility. In a modern digital world, we live in a world where advertising follows people whether they're watching TV, streaming platforms, or on social media. The line between entertainment and promotion is becoming harder to see, especially for younger audiences. In that kind of environment, the question is not whether people should be allowed to participate in sports betting, but whether our current approach is clear, consistent, and appropriate for the reality that we're seeing today. Mr. Speaker, it's also worth noting that Canada is not alone in facing this issue. Other G7 countries have already begun taking a closer look at how sports betting and advertising and the impact that it can have. In some cases, they have introduced clearer national rules around when and how these ads can appear, especially during times when young people are likely to be watching. By comparison, Canada's approach remains more broken up. We rely heavily on provinces, industry standards, and evolving guidelines, all without a national picture. It doesn't mean that those efforts are not important, but it does highlight that we may be lagging behind when it comes to having a universal understanding of the issue. This is a great way to begin closing the gap by making sure we're looking at this in a more complete way. Now, Conservatives believe in personal freedom. We believe that with freedom comes responsibility. Adults should be able to make their own choices. But freedom does not mean free for all. It does not mean flooding every sports game with gambling ads, and it does not mean ignoring the impact that this may have on families or young people. There's a clear difference between giving the Canadians the freedom to make a choice and surrounding them with constant pressure to make that choice. That distinction matters. Right now, different provinces and groups are trying different approaches. Some have rules on advertising, industry groups working on codes of conduct. The CRTC has also said it may align broadcasters with certain standards once they are finalized. So there's already activity happening across this country. The question is whether it is working well enough and whether it is consistent. This is where S211 comes in. It does not ban advertising. It does not take away provincial control. Instead, it asks for more coordination and for government to study what is actually happening. Some will say this isn't enough, and others will worry that it goes too far. What it really does is ask for a clear picture of the situation and whether our current system is working as intended. We're not trying to change the entire system overnight, but making sure we're asking the right questions and getting the full picture of what's happening. This industry is changing rapidly. The responsible thing to do would be for us to pause, review, and ensure that there are safeguards in place and they're doing what they're meant to do. At the end of the day, this issue is not about being for or against sports betting. It's about whether the system we have today is keeping up with the reality Canadians are living in. With constant advertising and young people at higher risk of being exposed when families start to feel the real financial and emotional pressure, it's fair to ask whether more coordination is needed. Bill S211 is a step toward bringing governments together, looking at the evidence and making sure that the rules reflect what's happening on the ground. Canadians expect us to take that kind of balanced, practical approach. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.